his arm.
You look down at the water, and you see things. Few fish, dolphins, sharks, maybe. Coral and the like. You don't feel afraid, no. You feel excited. Astonished, maybe. No. Fear? Fear's when you stare down at the water and something stares back at you. You can't see, don't want to see it, but it sees you. Fear don't take you then, though. No. That comes later. It's once you see it. Try to accept that this thing exists in this world, your world. Even as it grips you and drags you down. You're scared. Fear comes to you when your mind goes quiet. When all those questions swimming around, screaming back and forth go silent. Giving room to that little voice answering the one thing you never asked. Maybe didn't want to ask. But it tells you. That is when the fear hits you. When you hear that voice clear as crystal tell you, this is how I die.
The Deep Sea, an audio play anthology by Don Roberts. Story 1, The Bells. Narrated by Don Roberts. Dante Briggs, voiced by Josh Williams of Well Dadgum Pod. The Gray Man, voiced by the Vern of Cinema Recall Podcast. Harbor Master Dante Briggs tossed another log into the wood stove of his shack, closing the door and securing the latch. Shuffling back to the neglected bottle on his table, sat beside its equally neglected glass tumbler, exhaling a heavy groan as he sat back in his chair, one hand blindly searching the table for his box of matches. He knew he could raise the lights, even turn to the table and find them, but no more. He had declared as of this past hour he was done with the outside world. Turning on the light would only let others know he was still awake. Drunk or not, there would be someone looking to pound on his door and report something or someone, especially after the early evening's events. He hadn't found a moment to himself until just after 11. He wasn't going to give any more of his time. He swore he'd throw a fist at the next deckhand or captain that came over asking about the Ellie Marie. Even thinking the name drew an audible curse from his lips.
Shit.
Teeth still clenching the stem of his clay pipe, his hand found the matches, quickly clutching them into his palm. Most days, he never minded his job. Most days was even pleasant. He left them alone, and they knew better to leave him alone. It wasn't that he couldn't deal with the problems. No, he was good at dealing with things. He just couldn't stand morons, weekend captains, old men with old problems. But today had become a day for appearances. The Ellie Marie made sure of that. His throat ached again. He'd abused it with shouting out across the docks to make good and sure everyone heard what he didn't care to repeat again. He used it to shut up groups claiming the Ellie Marie had crashed into the docks. He used it to cuss out the groups claiming the men that fell from the ship and ran through the busy docks were pale lunatics. Pale they were, sickly maybe, but lunatics? No. Dante could count on one hand the number of sane individuals he'd known on any port in 30 years of sailing and saloon stumbling. Everyone's a little crazy, some more than others. No, that crew had the look and feel of those that got themselves lost and managed to find their way home. That's his theory, and that's what he told all the faces that came to show themselves to his. Still, he did have to wonder, even if in the most mildest of curiosity, what could drive someone to that point? How long had these men been out there that scurrying about on hand and foot seemed normal? Not that they did, of course, but he surely imagined they weren't far from that either. He released his hold on the pipe long enough to give his damp scalp a light rubbing under his cap with the stem before drawing himself back to his task. His fingertips, like a spider's legs, walked over the box of matches, positioning themselves before dragging it over to his side, releasing it for the small tin of pressed tobacco. Popping off the lid that had long lost its tight seal with little effort or delicacy, with a twist of his thumb he tore off a small chunk of the tobacco, rubbing it between his fingers and filling the small chamber of his pipe. He placed the stem back to the corner of his mouth, drawing out a match from the box. As he did, his eyes darted back to the window beside his table, staring out a long, silent moment. It wasn't that something caught his attention, more the opposite, expecting to see his own visage staring back at him and the dark, beaten red door of his shack. But he saw nothing. Perfect dark. He guessed time moved by faster than he remembered. Then again, maybe he'd had a bit more than he recalled in his glass. He struck the match against the table, igniting the tinder and drawing it to his pipe. Just as the tinder brought light to the room, a figure that had been waiting inside the room spoke out, voice disturbed and distant.
Three bells! 3 bells! And it comes for you.
The words spoke out of the dimly lit room to his right, startling him near out of his seat.
What the hell?
Wide-eyed, he turned and found the being given source to these words.
3 bells more! And it's found you. Save me! You save yourself.
Dante stood, kicking his chair back behind him as he did, smoke exhaling from his flared nostrils as he spat out at the nearly gray-looking man.
How you got in here ain't gonna mean 2 shits compared to how you're leaving. You get the hell out of here.
Gripping the man by his slickened coat, he stared daggers into the skinny shell of a man, immediately recognizing him as one of the men that stayed aboard the Ella Marie after the others skittered across the deck. The man stared back unmoved, unresponsive to the violent jerking of his coat.
Save me! You save yourself, please, I beg you!
Dante gritted his teeth around the stem of the clay pipe, drawing back a fist intent on enforcing his point into the eye socket of the man speaking nonsense. His fist landed into the thin pillow of flesh that made up the man's left eye and cheek. He swore the crazy gray man never even flinched. Dragging him across the floor, held in both fists, making his way to the door. The man, seeing where they were headed, suddenly came to life. Eyes bulging out, one bloodied, the other wild and darting, shaking his head, digging his heels into the slick floorboards.
No, save me! Save me! You save yourself! Look, you gotta believe me! They're coming! They went for what we did! What we found! We didn't mean to do it!
Shut it, you crazy asshole. I'll drag your ass out of that door and off that goddamn pier.
Please, You gotta believe me. We didn't do it. Had nothing to do with it. They brought it on board. They brought the damn thing, not me. Please help me. They find us. They'll kill us both.
He drew back his fist again. Dante buried it into the pouch of the man's stomach, causing him to empty its contents onto the floor. Coughing and gasping now as he was dragged across the floor, headed still to the door. The unnamed sailor began to sob between coughs. Dante reached for the door, near enough to see the handle, but stopped. The two men stood silent, posed in their struggle as Dante heard it too. Outside the shack, seeming distant but somehow so close, the sound of a buoy could be heard. Only it didn't sound like those Dante heard himself at points on shore. It was older, somehow, and it scared him to think it, like a warning. Several long seconds passed between each chime, but they heard them. Just as the man had told him, warned him. 3 bells, and it comes for you. 3 bells more, and it's found you. A strange sensation began to take hold of Dante. He felt the room slowly filling with static. Sound became muffled. His eyes began to fill with a haze slowly creeping inward. It was dulling his senses. He could feel it, but couldn't fight it. The man he held stopped struggling and simply shook his head, speaking out as if afraid to hear the level of his own voice, lowering it to almost a whisper.
It's coming. God help me, it's coming.
The man flung himself forward from Dante. Dante's hold had snapped at the silence following the 3rd bell. That was no buoy. What the hell was it then? He snapped back his attention to the absence of the man he held, ready to toss out the door. Finding him now madly dashing about the room, tossing open drawers and cabinets, searching. But for what? The haze Dante felt that had begun to creep out around his eyes and spill across his forehead began to lift, breathing out. The pipe, now long extinguished, still gripped by his feet. The sailor, eyes darting wildly, throwing open cabinet doors, pulling out drawers to the floor. A weapon. It stung at his brain like a blaring alarm. This madman was trying to find a weapon to defend himself. Dante pushed back his thick coat from his right hip, revealing his holstered revolver. His hand sat on the wood grip, tightly hugging it.
You stop this madness now. I'll shoot you, you crazy bastard. I don't want to, but God and I know it won't be the first man I've put in the ground.
The man turned around, eyes searching over Dante's form, finally laying eyes on the holstered revolver, smiling out of his mind almost in praise.
Do it.
Dante stared at the man. Was he really that far gone? Was he testing him? He pulled back the revolver from his holster, drawing back the hammer, cocking it. The man looked confusingly back at the harbor master, repeating himself.
Do it, please. Do it, shoot me, please. Save me. Save me and you.
It came again. Both men stared at one another, silently. 3 bells sounded again. The ringing came from the dock this time. He didn't know how he knew that. Didn't want to know how. But it had. And it was closer now. The haze again crept up into his eyes. Dante felt the warmth spreading over his forehead and seeping through his skull. He looked out to his hand, aiming the revolver at the crazed gray sailor. But his arm had begun to move. The sailor saw it too. Saw the harbor master go from pointing the gun dead center at his chest, now toward the window of the shack. The man staggered forward, taking hold of Dante's wrist.
Please. Please do it. Do it now. Save yourself and fucking shoot me.
Dante's eyes were locked on the window, still reflecting perfect dark. But he saw something. In the pitch black painted across the window, he swore to God he saw something. And it gripped at his spine, holding him there. The man jerked his wrist again, pushing the barrel of the revolver into his chest, slapping Dante. His old eyes were filling with a cloudy milk haze. The room seemed to be filling with a slow-growing silence, the static returning again, creeping from between the floorboards, pushing upward from around the nails and the bolts in the door. The static was consuming. Shaking him again, the gray man shrieked out at him, fighting the seemingly lifeless grip of Dante's fingers on the revolver. He tried in vain to pull at the trigger, but could not. He took to slapping at the harbor master, 3 strikes across his face. Dante felt jerked out of a deep sleep and stared wildly at the man holding the barrel of his revolver against his chest. Pulling back, he shoved the man hard enough he slipped and lost his footing. The gray man stumbled and fell to the floor with a solid thud. As Dante stumbled, desperate to balance himself, his hip slapped into the table, jerking it upward, toppling its contents. The barrel-chested harbor master soon landed on the floor as well, opposite the crazed gray man. His hand had never let go of the revolver. He wiped a hand across his face, the skin damp, like a rag he could rip away in a shower of screams, more fearing for the loss of his sanity as he felt it trickling with the sweat painted across his brow. He had no way to explain what it was that froze him in place, the chilling but somehow calming static that lulled him away from this reality for one horrifying moment. His eyes narrowed in the darkness of the shack, focusing as best he could manage, searching for the madman that had tried taking possession of his revolver, the only item grounding him here and now in his hand, a symbol of safety and the promise of salvation. He lifted his arm and began to sweep from left to right, scanning the room, a room he'd realized had grown eerily silent after all that had taken place in the past few moments. Even the ravings from the gray man had stopped. He could hear his own raspy breathing, felt the pulse in his tight grip around the revolver. His eyes began to adjust, making out the doorway ahead of him, leading to the bedroom, the table just to his right, a thick worn leather chair to his left. He carefully and quietly slid a hand up along the wall behind him to help steady himself, preparing to lift himself from the floor. He heard something, a wet, heavy something. It thumped against the door, not like a man bashing their side into a door attempting to break it down, not a knock of a fist or collapsing of a man's frame against it, but a wet, heavy sound of something landing, pressing to the door. His arm swung over immediately to it, pistol aimed in the darkness. His eyes fixed fully on the door, slowly filling out more details. The door was warped. Immense pressure on the opposite side was causing the door to bow and warp at its center. He didn't want to speak, but he found himself doing so. He didn't want to say it, admit aloud for any near enough to hear, let alone to himself. Of all things he could have and would have said, the only thing he could do to stop himself was to cuss out whoever, whatever, was out there.
Get the fuck away from my door and the hell off my pier. When I pull this trigger, buddy, you'll either be the sorriest bleeding asshole I've ever seen or the deadest.
But nothing worked. He had just admitted it to himself before he even spoke the words. It wasn't a someone. It was a something. He gritted his teeth, fighting back from letting the words spill out, but his lips cracked and forced themselves out to the open.
What the hell did you bring here?
The words repeated over and over in his head, eyes widening as he saw the door bow even further. The wood, just now starting to strain and splinter, groaning under the pressure. He tasted chalk in his mouth mixed with copper, only then aware he'd bitten through the clay pipe and into his lip. Mouth seeping blood, he held his breath. He began to realize the only sounds he heard now in the shack were his own. The yet-to-be-seen-again sailor had remained deathly silent, still unsure where he was. Before, he couldn't wait for the man to shut up and leave. Now he was nearly praying the man would speak so he knew he wasn't alone.
Say something, you crazy asshole.
He whispered out in demand, spitting blood as he did. Waving the gun around, then stopping, he heard something. A dragging sound. But this wasn't coming from outside. No, it was coming from within. Not the doorway, though. Could the gray man have injured himself when he fell? Now trying to make his escape? Was he thinking of making a run for the bedroom and locking Dante out here with whatever the hell was now outside?
Too late!
His trigger finger twitched. He used all the restraint he could to keep from pulling the trigger when he heard those words. It wasn't because they were finally responding to him. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. The voice he heard, warning him before of the bells. This was not that voice. This voice was broken and disturbed, like something from a nightmare. When it spoke, it didn't sound human. It sounded like a monster, something spewing water out as it spoke. The words began to carry a chill with them. He could hear in his words, between the sounds he made as they came out, liquid pouring out with them. Again, the dragging sound. And something else. Something more. He had no way of ever describing it accurately. It was something he had never heard. From any man, boat, any creature. Then came the smell. A smell he was intimately familiar with. A rotting, deep scent of the sea. His mind snagging the image it rushed to as the scent and taste of memory filled him, remembering as a teenager dragging a net along the shallows and dredging up several decaying fish bodies. He could feel the slime now on his hands, just as it had been when he was young and picked one up. It scared him, causing him to examine his hands to make sure he wasn't holding the body now, cursing his mind for conjuring up these sensations and memories more clearly as he focused on it, until it passed again. The dragging noise had not stopped this time. Something was moving. He took aim, careful aim. His ears pounding along with his chest, zeroing in on the dragging. He wrapped both hands around the gun. One held the grip of the revolver tightly. The other held the base and his hand tighter. Steadying his aim, a new sound came from the dragging. This time it was the cracking of glass. It wasn't the window being broken for something to get in. How did he miss this? It was a sound of already broken glass being pushed aside, falling free of an already broken frame. He missed it. Somehow he missed it, and something had broken the window. But he had it now. He knew exactly where this thing was. His brain sparked, and before he realized he'd given the command to his body, his finger pulled back on the trigger and the room exploded in a cloud of bright fire from the .357 held in both hands, bathing the room in enough light to paint into reality exactly what he had heard and now, for the love of God, saw. In his shack, resting over the table he'd sat at earlier filling his pipe, a large, long shape slithered from outside the window into the room. Slithered across the floor and coiled around the body of the gray sailor. His face frozen in an expression of silent pain, eyes completely white, a dark green fluid flowing from his open mouth, the thing itself wrapping around him. It was coated in thin, almost translucent scales, the skin a sickly yellow and green, coated in a gray slime that trailed across the room and marked the path of its entry. It was dragging the body across the floor and out the window. His eyes traced its movement into those few seconds he saw the room lit up. In the corner of the room, Above the window, he saw more. More of these serpent-like appendages. 2, maybe 3 more, shorter ones. Flattened against the wall and corner of the ceiling. Terror crept up and gripped him firmly once the light from the gunfire had cleared. He didn't know if he struck it, the walls, or the sailor. None of it mattered now. He saw it. He knew it was something real, something very close, and something that came for that man. He understood all too late why the man pleaded with him to be shot, wishing he'd done it for both of their sakes. But nothing could have convinced him of what he just witnessed had it not been for his firing out into the dark. If it had been a possibility he would have considered, he knew he would have already gone insane having seen it, and realizing this, whatever it was, existed in a world he was born into and thought he understood. More glass broke away. A new, sickening sound came forth. The sound he knew and painfully identified as the noise of a body being pulled and wedged through the broken window. The room was covered in darkness once more. No more sounds. No dragging, no gurgling. Dead silence. He waited, sat against the wall on the floor, drooling out the collected blood pooling in his mouth, afraid to swallow it. More afraid to have his spitting be heard by those things that claimed the body. A gentle, cool breeze from the window caused him to shiver. He heard the sea again, as if all the sounds of the outside world, the real world, were slipping back into existence. He heard the gentle sound of the waves, the creaking of ropes securing boats to the dock, the flicker of a light somewhere outside. He wanted to scream. He wanted to laugh as loudly and crazily as anyone could, until his throat would strain and bleed. But he didn't. He sat there, listening to the sounds of the sea and the night, barely aware how shallow his breathing had become, of the fact his arms laid between his legs, clutching the gun still. He sat there, waiting for his turn to come, for that thing to return and take him. He felt like his mind was on the brink, that everything balanced on the thinnest of hairs in those moments. He couldn't stop it from happening. He hadn't even tried. He had reached the limits few will ever, with great luck, never experience. He had fully accepted this life now, this moment, where fear, real fear, took him. In that moment, caught between reality and dream, Dante finally breathed out into the quiet of night's return, giving in to the need for calm, trying to embrace some sense of normalcy. But off in the distance, out at sea, that moment was broken, shattered with the roar of a thing he could not and did not wish to see. A thing that had come for that man, came into his shack that night and took him. 3 bells, and it comes for you. 3 bells more, and it's found you. The thin hair had snapped. Off in the distance, out at sea, Dante Briggs heard the quiet sound of a buoy bell as the waves crashed into it, into the night. He sat there, silently, and began to weep.